Hello and welcome back to Animated Literacy. This is part 5 in the overview and research for the program. In part 4 we talked about the role of context and movement in memory and in learning specifically sounds of the language and the letters that are used to spell those sounds. In this part we're going to expand on that by talking about how to link literature to the alphabet characters, introduce rare words, and use those rare words both for word recognition as well as comprehension. We'll also talk about multi-meaning words and how to scaffold instruction. So to begin with, I want to return to what we talked about at the very end of the last session, which was about the joy of reading. And this was the article that used animated literacy as an example of kind of going against the grain, where many teachers had complained with No Child Left Behind that the joy of teaching and learning wasn't there, and that in animated literacy it was. So I want you to look at the picture again of the children in Kansas City, Kansas, who were gesturing the sounds for animated literacy. And I want you specifically to look at their eyes. When I first started teaching, I taught in middle-class neighborhoods where children were generally successful in learning to read and write. And one of the things I noticed about children in that environment was that their eyes constantly twinkled. There was a sparkle in their eyes. And then when I moved to poverty areas, what I discovered is many of the children had these kind of glazed over expressions. So learning about Marion Diamond, who talked about neuroplasticity and the way things that we have to do for the brain to grow, and we used a quote that we're going to keep coming back to, where she tells us that the brain is only as smart as it needs to be, and that all animals are tuned to conserve energy. So the only way to grow a bigger, brighter brain is to put children into a challenging environment. And certainly bedtime stories and great literature provides that kind of a context. So when I look into the children's eyes, it was my objective when I moved to low-income schools to get the kids' eyes to dance, just like they danced in the more affluent schools. And I now believe that when you look at a children's eyes, if you see those eyes dancing, then the brain is growing, just as Marion Diamond talked about when we're molding that brain. But if you see those glazed expressions and you see that boredom, Marion Diamond tells us that the brain is in all likelihood shrinking. So we definitely want our kids' brains to grow. So it's my objective to get their eyes to dance. The custodian at the school that I taught in for about 10 years told me that when the kids lined up for lunch, he called my kids bright eyes because he could see a difference in the eyes of the kids in my classroom versus other classrooms at the school, because my kids' eyes were dancing, and that was no accident. That's one of the main objectives of animated literacy. Children naturally are interested in rare words. In fact, our brain is programmed for novelty. So if you're using very common, mundane kinds of words, the kids aren't going to pay very much attention to them. And the only way to learn things, as we learned in the session 1, is to provide emotional input. So one way that we provide emotional input is by using words that kids don't see very often. And we know how much children love the names of dinosaurs. And so Keith Stanovich tells us that children's books, children's literature like we would use for bedtime stories, has 50% more rare words than does adult primetime television and the conversation of college graduates. So about the only place that children can be exposed to rare words is from reading to them. This is an example of a rare word I'll show you in just a moment. How many of you have ever heard the word tuffet? When I was first looking for a word to use as an example, I came upon this word. And I looked it up in several dictionaries that didn't even contain the word. And my spell check on my computer at that time didn't contain the word tuffet. So that tells me it's a pretty rare word. Then I asked teachers at my workshops if they actually knew the definition of tuffet. And it was rare for a teacher to know what that word actually meant. In the dictionaries that I was looking it up in at the time, it said it's a three-legged milking stool. Or in the Oxford Dictionary, the English use of that word was also a tuft of grass. Where do you know that word from? There's only one place I know of that word is really used. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet eating her curds and whey. So these old nursery rhymes in many cases contain a lot of rare words. And because they put them into a rhyme structure that the brain responds to even before birth, we tend to remember those rare words for a long, long time. We may not know what they mean, but we know what they sound like. Jamie Lee Curtis wrote a book about big words for little people. And I happened to catch an interview with her on one of the morning news programs. And she was talking about that as a child, she wasn't read to. And so consequently, she didn't get the opportunity to hear a lot of rare words. And so she loved to read, and she was very good at decoding. So she would sound out these words, but when you sound out a word, it often doesn't give you the correct pronunciation. It gives you instead an approximation. So she told in this interview that her favorite word when she was very young was paradigm. But every time she said paradigm, people laughed at her. Because if you've heard that word before, you would correct it and you would pronounce it as paradigm. So it's critical, if children are decoding and they're going to be able to pronounce words correctly, that those words are stored in their listening vocabulary. So we often think of vocabulary of needing to know the meaning of a word, when in fact the pronunciation of the word is just as important. Because whenever you sound out a word, you are simply, in many cases, approximating that word, and then you have to reach back into your listening memory of words and into context to correct the pronunciation of the word. Becoming a Nation of Readers back in 1985 supported that view. They said all that phonics can be expected to do is help children approximate pronunciations. We went through a number of years where there were great attacks on phonics, and there have been, for decades, there's been arguments because people have said our language is not phonetically regular. We have all of these words that you simply cannot sound out. And I heard people from Australia say, listen to my accent. How could you possibly write down the same letters for a word and I pronounce it with an Australian accent and somebody else pronounces it in their particular accent? Well, the reason for that, and what they fail to recognize, is that the brain's not an empty vessel, as we talked about before. The brain has stored all of this information, and all new information coming into the brain is checked against the old information stored in the brain. So as soon as you decode a word by sounding it out, the brain checks to see, does that match a word that's stored in the listening vocabulary? And if it doesn't, then it checks with the context of the word, it checks with the approximation you've provided, and quickly corrects that. But if you've never heard the word, you can't complete that process. This is a poster that I found some time ago and really like. It says, don't be afraid to use big words with little kids. If they can say Tyrannosaurus Rex, they can say anything. And we all know how much most children love the sound of dinosaur names. But it's not just the big words like Tyrannosaurus Rex that children need to know about. It's words that have multiple meanings. Robert Ornstein tells us that the left hemisphere does most of our decoding process for most of us. But the left hemisphere can only handle one meaning for a word. So the left hemisphere comes up with often the most common meaning of the word, and then quickly it shifts over to the right hemisphere, which holds context and multi-meaning words to check to see what the meaning of that word might be. Marianne Wolf addresses this in her book Proust and the Squid. She says, when we read a simple word like bug, we activate not only the more common meaning, a crawling six-legged creature, but also the bug's less frequent associations, spies, Volkswagens, glitches in software, or if you say my brother's bugging me, he's probably not putting insects on you, he's bothering you. If you say I have a bug in my telephone, it's probably a listening device, not an insect. Or if you say I came to school in a bug today, it's probably a Volkswagen. So there are many different meanings, and if children don't know those meanings, it's going to affect their comprehension. And many of those meanings come to us through literature. Marianne Wolf goes on to say, children with a rich repertoire of words and their associations will experience any text or any conversation in ways that are substantially different from children who do not have the same stored words and concepts. So one of our goals in reading to children is to provide them with as much vocabulary as we can, provide them with the pronunciations for as many rare words as we can, and provide them with as many alternate meanings for words as we can. If you're not thoroughly convinced yet that we need to surround children with as rich a language as possible, what we do with our children in the early grades can affect the quality of their life 60 or 70 years later, as was shown in research that was done by David Snowden and that came out in Aging with Grace. He did studies with the nuns of Notre Dame, and they were like 80, 90, some up to 100 years old. And some had dementia, and some did not. So he discovered, after he'd been working with them for a while, that all of the nuns had entered the convent at about 20 to 22 years old. And when they entered the convent, they were all required to write a brief autobiography about themselves. These were all stored in a file cabinet. And so he went and he got the file cabinet out. Now, there is no way up to this point to prevent Alzheimer's disease. But it turns out there are ways of delaying the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. What he discussed, so they did a blind study. The nuns agreed to donate their brains to science, and they agreed to have their mental and physical abilities assessed each year until their death. Then upon their death, the researchers presented two things. One researcher presented the cognitive and physical information from the nun to see how they were doing, and the other presented the information from dissecting their brains to see if there were the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease, or if they were free from those plaques and tangles. Well, in many cases, the plaques and tangles predicted the ability of the nuns, but there were these cases where it did not predict. One nun in particular that he talked about got Alzheimer's disease, and as soon as she was afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, she forgot the name of all of her friends. She lost most of her mental abilities. But when they dissected her brain, they discovered she didn't have hardly any plaques and tangles. She was only in stage 1 of Alzheimer's disease. Another nun that was as sharp as a tack until the day she died, when they looked at her brain, she was stage 4 with plaques and tangles and all of the physical attributes of Alzheimer's disease. So when he compared these nuns to their writing, what he discovered was that the nuns who had delayed the onset of Alzheimer's disease had what was termed high idea density in their writing. That is, their sentences had more than one idea per sentence. The nuns that were overtaken by Alzheimer's disease very quickly were the nuns whose writing had only one idea per sentence. Now, when you look at our early basal readers, most of those have one simple idea per sentence. The boat can go, the car can go, the truck can go, I see a bug, I see a tree, I see a house. And if we surround children only with low idea sentences, they're going to only write with low idea sentences. But if we surround them with complex language, with multiple ideas per sentence, and with rare words, then there's a very good chance they'll write with higher idea density, have more complex brains, and if unfortunate enough to get Alzheimer's disease, they'll be able to delay the symptoms. So how do we start with rich language like that and still teach children the skills that are necessary to be able to decode and read and write with fluency? The answer is to scaffold instruction. Vygotsky, back in the 1920s and 30s, talked about this concept. And Vygotsky's basic concept agrees with Marion Diamond. He said the only good learning is that which is in advance of development. What a child can do with assistance today, she will be able to do by herself tomorrow. So his message was, start with information that is well beyond the child's developmental level, and then assist the child in being able to handle that information, and then gradually throughout the course of instruction keep reducing that assistance until what the child can do with assistance today, she'll be able to do all by herself tomorrow. Then he went into 3 ways that we can assist children. One way was simply copying. And we do this in animated literacy for everything that I introduce. The first thing I ask children to do when I bring in information that I know they're not capable of doing yet is to simply copy me while I do it. Then the second thing is I may start something and they finish it for me. And I would do this often with predictable sentences. So I will produce the first part of the sentence and then stop before the end of the sentence and have the child complete it. The third way was simply to perform the task with the assistance of an adult or a more capable individual. And then gradually you keep reducing that assistance until the child takes over and does it on their own. The second part of scaffolding is the order in which we instruct things. And Marion Diamond, we've talked about, gave us the order that the senses develop in and that language develops in. So the first sense to develop is our tactile kinesthetic. So I provide lots of gestures and also, whenever possible, manipulatives for the kids to touch. So they're moving their muscles, they're gesturing, they're touching, and everything begins there because that's our first sense. Then gradually we move up to hearing, and then vision is the last thing we bring in. So hearing is where we're teaching sounds, because sounds are auditory. And you'll see in the next two sessions when we get into instructing our sounds, I don't even worry about letters because that's our visual in the early periods. Once the kids have become really good at those sounds, then the drawing and labeling process will teach them how to connect those sounds to letters and letter patterns so that they'll be able to decode words and have great word recognition skills. So the first things we look at then are gestures because they're tactile kinesthetic. Then babies produce vowels, so we start with vowels next, and in our next part we're going to explore the gestures for our vowel characters. Then they move on to consonants, then single words, then phrases, and finally sentences. This order is the same for all students, and Stanley Greenspan reinforces this concept. Stanley Greenspan spent his entire life working with autistic children. And what he said about them was that each of these children with autism progress at a slower rate as they work around problems processing sounds, words, sights, touch, and movement. But all of those who have made very good progress travel the same road and arrive at the same destination as other children. So if they're going to be able to move through the stages of language development, they are going to require a lot more time and a lot more assistance than many other children, but the sequence remains constant. So the variable is not the sequence. It's the time and the level of assistance needed to pass through that sequence. And I've had reports back from special education teachers working with Down syndrome children, as well as children with autism, and they do extremely well with animated literacy because it follows that natural sequence. In Proust and the Squid, Marianne Wolf informs us that Thomas Edison, Leo da Vinci, Albert Einstein are three of the most famous people who are said to have had dyslexia. So dyslexia doesn't just affect people at the lower end, it affects very bright people as well. So these individuals had to have a lot of time and assistance to learn to speak and read and write well, even though they were brilliant in the things they were capable of accomplishing. She goes on to say some children need more help than others with one or more of the parts of reading. And so that's what animated literacy does, is it keeps presenting children with the whole picture first, by reading to them, singing with them, presenting them with complex language, with rhythm and melody. Then, as it continues to expose them to all of the parts of language, it focuses on developing mastery of those parts in a natural developmental sequence. When parents read to their babies their bedtime stories, they naturally scaffold reading. If they're reading to children before birth or in the first few months before children even begin to produce sounds, they don't ask for feedback from the children. They just simply read the song in a very sing-songy manner, like we demonstrated with Dr. Seuss's book Cat in the Hat. Then as the child is beginning to mature, the parent begins to point to and name objects, and then they start to ask the child, "Oh, can you point to the duck? Can you tell me the name of that picture?" Then they start to move on from single words like duck that they're pointing to words that describe and words that have actions. So now they're moving to the two-word phrase. So they're going, what color is the duck? What is the duck doing? And then the next step is they start to access prior knowledge, which we've talked about is critical to comprehension. So they start asking remember when questions. Where did we see a duck? Oh, we were at the lake. And what did we feed the duck? And what did the duck say? And what did the duck do? Then as you get into more complex literature in your bedtime stories, you start connecting to more advanced prior knowledge. This is a quote from Jasper Fforde in his novel, Something Rotten. He tells us that that's the magic of a book. A few dozen words conjure up an entire picture. Each interpretation of an event, setting, or character is unique to each of those who read it because they clothe the author's description with the memory of their own experiences. So everybody who reads the book is going to interpret it a little bit differently because everyone who reads it has different prior knowledge and experiences. He also goes on to say why it is that we like rereading the same stories over and over again. He tells us every time a book is read by the same person, it is different again, because the reader's experiences have changed or he is in a different frame of mind. So in our next session, we're going to move into our vowel characters, and I'm going to introduce you to all the gestures they use, but we'll also talk about how we can surround them with the language of the character stories as well as the language of quality books. So thank you again for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next session.